I always felt too much, too deeply, too strongly, too loudly in the silence of rooms that never heard me. Even as a child, my tears came quicker than others, and my joy burned hotter too, like a match that flared with too much desperation. At the dinner table, my parents would exchange glances when my voice quivered over a story from school, over a classmate's cruelty, over a dog left in the cold rain. My mother called it dramatics. My father called it weakness. I didn't have the words back then to call it what it truly was. Sensitivity that could split my chest open like lightning. I was 8 when I first tried to make myself smaller, biting my lip, swallowing sobs, counting backwards in my head to kill emotion before it reached my throat. My brother laughed once when I cried during a cartoon, and I remember the sharp red heat in my cheeks not from the joke, but from the shame I felt for being the punchline. At 12, I wrote poetry in the margins of my textbooks, hiding metaphors, under algebraic equations like secrets only I could decode. When my teachers praised my emotional insight, my parents said, "That's nice, but what about your grades?" They feared I'd grow into someone they couldn't explain to neighbors. They were right. By 14, I'd learned how to disappear in plain sight, to hold my face like a mask in family photos, smiling with teeth that clenched instead of grinned. I loved them still, of course. I loved them the way a fire loves the logs it destroys, with a kind of hunger that aches, even as it burns. The final straw came during the Thanksgiving I turned 17 when I told them I wanted to study art and make people feel things for a living. My father scoffed, leaned back in his chair and said, "You think the world cares about your feelings? You're too soft. You'll never make it." My mother added quietly, as if it were compassion, "We just don't want you to be disappointed when no one wants what you have to offer." But what they didn't know, what they never saw, was that my sensitivity wasn't a weakness. It was a weapon. I left home 6 months later with 2 suitcases, a sketchbook full of trembling truths, and enough silence packed inside my ribcage to build an echo chamber. I slept on couches, worked night shifts, and cried under fluorescent lights in gas station bathrooms. I wrote songs from heartbreak, painted canvases with memory, built sculptures out of rejection letters. I gave my hurt a home, gave it color, shape, music, language, and people came. They stood in gallery halls with tears on their cheeks, strangers, clutching their chests, saying, "I felt this." They didn't know me, but they knew me. Every emotion I had been shamed for became currency in a world hungry for authenticity. And suddenly I wasn't too sensitive. I was gifted. I was visionary. I was the voice of a generation. The critics called my work a raw nerve exposed to the light. I let them, though I knew that nerve had a name, and it was me. Then came the interview on national TV, the one where I said, without flinching, I was disowned for being too sensitive, and now that sensitivity is my legacy. My parents didn't call, not then, but when the awards started piling up, when my face appeared on magazine covers and art sold for 6 figures, they found my number. A voicemail from my mother, soft and uncertain. "We're proud of you. We always were." A text from my father. "You've really made something of yourself. Let's catch up." I stared at the screen for hours, remembering how I once begged them just to see me, to believe that my feelings weren't a flaw but a compass. Now they wanted a piece of the map I'd drawn from every scar they ignored. And this was only the beginning. The first time I saw them again, it wasn't a reunion. It was a performance, and I was both the audience and the actor, playing the version of me they thought they wanted. They arrived at my New York showcase in coats too expensive for the people they once claimed to be. Holding hands like a fragile treaty was stitched between their fingers. My mother's eyes scanned the crowd before they met mine, as if looking for someone more impressive, more worth her worry. My father's handshake was firm, rehearsed, something he had practiced in the mirror before facing the child he once told to get over it. "Look at all this," he said, sweeping his hand toward the walls filled with my art. his voice carrying the tremble of a man trying to act like he was never wrong. My mother lingered in front of a piece I made from torn letters and fabric soaked in inked grief, a work I'd created after the night she told me I'd ruined the family with my emotions. She whispered, "This one is powerful." I said nothing. She didn't recognize the paper was from the letter I wrote her that was never answered. They smiled for the photographers like proud parents, mouths twitching at the corners as if muscles remembered how to show affection, but the heart had forgotten. People assumed they had supported me all along, assumed because they were here, because they stood close to me in photos, because the illusion was easier than the truth. The truth was this: I had built myself from the ruins of their refusal. Every canvas was a defiance. Every exhibit was a scream. Every frame held pieces of the child they'd silenced. At the after-party, my mother touched my arm and said, "You've always been special. We just didn't know how to handle it." And I nearly laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was cowardice wrapped in nostalgia, the kind that stains and pretends it's perfume. "You didn't handle me," I said calmly. "You erased me." She looked like she might cry, and for a second I saw a flicker of the woman I had once begged to see me, but even then I didn't know if it was guilt or just regret at being left out. My father cleared his throat and offered, "We'd like to come by your studio sometime. Maybe see how you work." And I pictured them in my sanctuary, touching things they had no right to touch, claiming to understand processes they once mocked, applauding the sensitivity they tried to kill. But instead of rage, I felt a strange, hollow mercy, like watching shadows try to warm themselves in a sun they never believed in. I nodded, but not in agreement. It was a nod of acknowledgement. I saw them. I saw their hunger. I saw the years they'd tried to skip, like pages in a book they didn't want to read. When they left that night, I didn't hug them. I watched them walk away like visitors in a museum of their own forgotten cruelty. I went home to a loft I bought with pain turned into power, to shelves lined with awards that never healed me, but did somehow vindicate me. I poured a glass of wine and stood in front of the newest piece I'd been sculpting, something raw and unfinished, still streaked with the fingerprints of recent heartbreak. It was a monument to all the nights I'd cried without witness, to all the apologies I'd whispered into darkness that never answered. I thought of every time I was called too much, too dramatic, too fragile. And I knew now with full and heavy clarity that I had never been too anything. I had simply been more than they could understand. And now that the world understood, now that the world celebrated the very things they tried to shame me for, they wanted a seat at a table I built from my own bones. But bones remember, and I wasn't sure they deserved a place among the ruins they once helped create. The invitations kept coming after that night. Carefully worded emails, polite texts, birthday cards with handwritten notes that strained with sincerity. They wanted dinner, conversation, a chance to reconnect. They told me how proud they were, how they always knew I had something special inside me, as if they hadn't tried to rip it out every time it made them uncomfortable. There were apologies, the kind that hovered on the surface like frost, cold, brittle, beautiful only, from a distance. But not once did they say the words I needed. We were wrong. Instead, they offered stories of their own wounds, their own parents who didn't know how to deal with feelings either, as though pain passed down could excuse pain inflicted. I listened, but I did not offer absolution. I had learned that forgiveness is not owed, especially when it's begged only after the success they once doubted. Still, I met with them. Curiosity is a strange hunger. We sat at a restaurant too fancy for true conversations, where the silverware glinted like armor and the air smelled of truffle oil and unspoken truths. My mother complimented my shirt, my father asked about upcoming projects. and for a moment it almost felt like family, until it didn't. Until my father leaned in and said, "Your story could help so many people. Maybe we could do something together?" He meant a book. He meant a documentary. He meant, "Let me in now that you've made it out." My skin tightened, a coldness rising from my chest to my throat. They didn't want healing. They wanted credit. They wanted to bask in the glow of the phoenix without ever acknowledging they lit the fire that killed it. "You want to be part of the story," I said, slow and careful, "but not the part you actually played." They flinched, just slightly, and I felt that familiar ache, the part of me that still, foolishly, wanted their love. But I also felt something stronger, the unshakable steadiness of a person who built their own worth from the wreckage of rejection. I looked at my mother and saw the lines time had carved around her eyes, saw her sadness like a veil she wasn't ready to lift. "You told me I was broken," I said. "And now that I turned those cracks into art, you want to call them beautiful." "I didn't know how to love you back then," she said softly. And there it was, the closest thing to truth I would get. I nodded. "I know. But I did." It wasn't cruelty that kept me distant after that. It was clarity. I didn't cut them out. But I didn't let them in either. Not beyond the front porch of my life. Not past the threshold where the real parts of me lived. I continued creating. I let my sensitivity bloom unchecked, turned vulnerability into gold, heartbreak into exhibitions, quiet suffering into best-selling essays, and people saw themselves in my work, in the trembling, in the reaching, in the way I wore sorrow like silk and let it flow behind me. Fans would tell me they felt seen for the first time, that they too were called too much, that they had never felt safe until they heard their own ache echoed in my voice. And I gave them what I never had: permission to feel, permission to hurt, permission to rise unashamed. I no longer wept in secret. I cried on stage. I cried in interviews. I cried in ink and sculpture and sound. And the world didn't turn away. It leaned in, because it wasn't weakness. It was truth. And in a world built on pretending, truth is the most radical, most terrifying, most magnetic thing there is. I began to understand that my sensitivity wasn't just my power. It was my rebellion. It was my revolution. It was the one thing they couldn't steal now. Not with guilt, not with invitations, not with carefully posed smiles. I had finally become the person I needed when I was young, and nothing could make me hand that person over to the ones who had abandoned them. It happened quietly, how closure crept in like dusk, not sudden or loud, but slow and certain, until I looked around one day and realized I was no longer haunted. The wounds still existed, of course. Some things never stop aching, but the sting softened, like an old bruise remembered only when pressed. I no longer needed to prove anything to them, or to the world, or even to the child I used to be who cried into pillowcases so no one would hear. That child had grown into someone magnificent, someone tender and unbreakable, and I protected them fiercely, not by fighting, but by living fully, by refusing to shrink even an inch for anyone again. I turned down the documentary deal, politely, calmly. I told them, "This story is mine, all of it, and I'm not handing it over to people who only found value in it once others did." My father sighed, said he understood, but I don't think he really did. My mother cried, not loudly, but in that quiet way she used to cry when she didn't know how to ask for help. Still, I didn't move to comfort her, because sometimes growth means staying where you are while others learn how to meet you there. The press moved on to new headlines, new faces. The frenzy faded. Fame never lasts the way pain does, but peace can endure. I retreated from the spotlight little by little, choosing silence when I used to choose noise, solitude where I once sought applause, but I never stopped creating. My art became softer in color but deeper in meaning. Still raw, but less about surviving and more about living. I taught workshops to teenagers who cried too easily and were told it made them weak. I told them, "Your heart is not too loud. The world is just afraid of how clearly it speaks." I saw my younger self in their shaking hands and shimmering eyes. I gave them tools I had to carve from stone. I wrote a memoir, not for the fame, not for the money, but to leave a lighthouse for anyone lost in the same storm I once barely crawled out of. It became a bestseller, but more than that, it became a mirror for thousands. And I finally understood. My story wasn't just about what was taken from me. It was about what I chose to build in the absence of safety, what I dared to become without permission. One day, years later, I received a letter, handwritten, from my mother. No excuses this time, no veiled pride, just this. "I see now that your feelings were never a flaw. They were your fire. I'm sorry I tried to extinguish it." I read it 3 times, cried once, then I placed it in a drawer where I kept old photos, poems, and bits of my past I no longer needed to carry in my hands. I didn't write back, not out of cruelty, out of peace. Because sometimes healing means saying nothing and still feeling whole. Because sometimes forgiveness is silent. And sometimes the most radical act of love is choosing yourself, completely, unapologetically, eternally. So now when people call me too sensitive, I smile. Because they don't know it's a crown. They don't know it's the reason I survived. They don't know it's the reason I live.